The mule came limping through the tree line just past dawn, steam rising from its flanks. A girl slumped sideways in the saddle, arms tied to the horn, her head lowing with the rhythm of the animal's slow steps. Her skin was ash pale, her lips cracked open like old bark. She wore no coat, just a torn cotton shift under a man's oversized wool vest that hung off her bones like wet laundry. Isaiah Holt stood in the doorway of his cabin, one hand resting on the frame, the other holding a tin cup of coffee gone cold. He didn't move. The mule paused without instruction, as though it knew this was the place it had been meant to find. The girl didn't raise her head. Isaiah saw the rope first, knotted around the horn, looped loosely through her wrist. Then he saw the bruises, a sickly constellation across her throat, under her collarbone, along her jaw. They were faded. Some of them, others newer. None of them fresh. She didn't speak, neither did he. He walked down the steps, slow, boots crunching in the frost-bitten grass. The mule snorted once and flicked its ears. Isaiah reached for her gently, hands sure and quiet, and slid the girl down into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, just a breath of a person, brittle and burned out. She smelled of smoke and salt and rot. The rope came loose in his fingers. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He carried her inside and laid her on the cot near the stove. Then he lit a fire and boiled water. It took 3 days before she ate more than a spoonful. The first night she shook so violently, he thought her bones would crack. He covered her in every blanket he had, then sat on the floor beside her with a damp cloth and a bowl of barley broth that went cold untouched. The second day she opened her eyes, just once, just long enough to flinch when she saw him sitting there, then closed them again. He didn't speak to her, just nodded once and went back to stirring the soup. By the third morning, she sat upright against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, hands curled in the fists in the blankets. She hadn't made a sound. But when he placed the bowl on the floor beside her and stepped away, she reached for it with shaking hands. He didn't watch her eat. Instead, he took his coat off the peg and went out to chop wood. She had a voice, he figured, somewhere. But whoever had owned her before, because there was no doubt in Isaiah's mind she had been owned, had buried it deep, like water under frozen earth. He saw it in the way she flinched when the wind slammed the door, and how she flinched even harder when it didn't. Quiet frightened her more than noise. He watched, but didn't pry out. She watched him too, carefully, eyes tracking him whenever he came inside. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze was sharp behind the hollowness, not dull, not gone, just waiting. She was maybe 20, maybe younger. Her hair was hacked off unevenly, jagged around her jaw. Her face was angular with hunger. There were red raw places on her ankles and wrists where cuffs might have been. She hadn't cried. Not once. Not even in her sleep. Isaiah had seen 1,000 kinds of broken during the war. But this was quieter. This was a kind that didn't bleed out. It just stayed, frozen in the body like winter that refused to leave. One night, a week later, he came in from the woods carrying a haunch of deer, wrapped in hide. She was sitting near the stove, back pressed to the wall, blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the meat. He held it up. "You cook?" She didn't answer. He waited. She looked at the floor, then at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. She cooked in silence, but the way she held the knife, clean, steady, precise, told him she hadn't always been a ghost. Her hands moved with instinct, chopping wild onion, stripping dried herbs from his shelf, adding salt like memory. The stew smelled like something close to comfort. She didn't eat until he did. And when he did, when he took the first bite and said nothing, she looked almost disappointed. He met her eyes. "Good," he said. Then went back to eating. She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped just enough for him to notice. The next day, she swept the cabin. The day after that, she mended one of his shirts. No asking, no permission. He left a tin of tea on the table with 2 cups. She brewed it before noon. He didn't ask about the bruises. He didn't ask about the faint marks on her scalp, as though she'd been dragged by the hair. He didn't ask about the burn under her collarbone that looked like the shape of a cross, seared in with cruel intention. He knew what it meant. He'd seen it before, 2 weeks in. Sheriff Packer came riding up the ridge. Isaiah met him outside before he could dismount. The sheriff tipped his hat. Got folks down in Hemlock say a girl went missing from some camp south of the Salt Range. Isaiah didn't answer. The sheriff looked past him, toward the chimney smoke. Preacher by the name of Malrick got himself a flock, but they don't call it a church. Isaiah crossed his arms. Just checking if you'd seen anyone, the sheriff added. I seen a lot of things, Isaiah said, and none worth reporting. The sheriff squinted. You sure about that? Isaiah said nothing. The sheriff didn't press, just tugged his reins and turned the horse around. You ever want to talk? He said over his shoulder. You know where to find me. Isaiah nodded once, then went back inside. That night, she sat across from him at the table for the first time, still wrapped in the blanket, still silent. But when he passed her the bread, she broke it in half and gave him the larger piece. He didn't thank her, didn't have to. She'd heard it anyway. Spring thaw came late that year. The snow melted in layers, reluctant and gray, like the land had forgotten how to be warm. Drips echoed in the eaves, and the muddy slope outside Isaiah's cabin turned slick with ice-wet soil. But the girl Elena, though she hadn't said it yet, moved more freely now. She'd taken to walking the perimeter of the clearing with her hands tucked inside her sleeves. She never went far, never into the trees, but she walked it every morning and every dusk, slow and steady, as if she was learning the shape of a world that wouldn't hit her. Isaiah watched her from the porch. Sometimes she looked back, never with fear, just waiting, like she still wasn't sure if this piece was real. Inside the cabin, she'd started using her hands again, not for flinching or guarding, for doing. She sanded the shelves with leftover cloth. She organized the tools on the wall. She made a stew from dried mushrooms and venison that nearly made Isaiah remember what it felt like to live with someone who wasn't fading still. She didn't speak, but Isaiah learned to listen anyway. He watched the way she tugged her sleeves when she was cold, how she held her breath when the wind rose through the trees, stiffening as though she expected screams in it, how her eyes darkened when she touched the branded skin on her chest, not because it hurt anymore, but because she remembered who had given it. She had a knife now, one of Isaiah's smaller ones. She kept it tucked under her mattress, though he saw it in her lap some nights when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't take it from her, didn't ask her why. He understood. One evening, after supper, she pointed to the ash bucket and raised her eyebrows. Isaiah nodded. She took it outside without a word. The sound of her steps in the snow, the scrape of the metal, ordinary things, but they comforted him in ways he didn't admit, even to himself. It was 10 minutes before he realized she hadn't come back. He rose, slowly, the way men do who've seen bad things come in quiet moments. When he opened the door, she was standing just beyond the porch, ash bucket forgotten beside her boot. She was staring down the trail that led into the trees, frozen still, eyes wide. Isaiah followed her gaze. There was a charm nailed to a birch tree. Rough wood, shaped like a triangle, with red string knotted at the center. A cult symbol. One he remembered. One he'd seen hung over the gates of firelit camps where no women ever smiled. Isaiah stepped forward, took it down, and crushed it under his boot. Elena didn't move, didn't blink. But her hands had started to tremble. That night, she carved something. He came in late from the woods, arms full of kindling, and found her bent over the table, sleeves rolled, fingers red from pressing too hard into the blades held. She was carving a spoon. It wasn't clean work, chipped in places, splintered at the edges, but it was hers. She set it down when she saw him, and started to hide it. He stopped her with just a look. She held it out instead, not quite offering. Not quite asking, just showing him what her hands could still make. He took it, held it, ran his thumb over the rough edge, then nodded. Once, she went back to carving. The next morning, a hawk flew overhead, crying sharp into the silence. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she knelt by the fire pit outside and laid stones in a circle. She was building something, maybe a boundary, maybe a prayer. Isaiah watched from the window. When she stood, she looked taller, straighter, not full yet, not healed, but upright. He hadn't realized how long she'd been curled inward until she finally wasn't. He went to town that week. He didn't want to, knew it wasn't safe, but supplies were thinning and she needed more than dried beans and salt meat. She handed him a list she'd written herself, 3 items: soap, a mirror, paper. He read it twice, then nodded. Did in single quotes. He say a word. Didn't have to. Hemlock hadn't changed. Still a one-lane town with a post, a general store, and 3 men who watched Isaiah like he'd come carrying ghosts. He walked into the store, nodded once at the clerk, and picked up what she'd asked for. He paid in coin. No talk. Just quiet eyes and the weight of a man who didn't care to be seen. On his way out, he passed a flyer nailed to the post. Wanted, Elena La, any stolen from the flock. Dangerous, mute by judgment of the Lord. Reward paid for safe return. Sign, Ravi Ezekiel Malraki. Isaiah tore it down. Didn't say a word. Just folded it in half and tucked it into his coat. Back at the cabin, Elena was stirring stew. She turned when he opened the door, and for the first time, her lips parted to form a word. Not sound, not yet, but the shape of it. Thank you. He didn't answer. Just set the paper, the soap, and the small brass mirror down on the table. Then placed the folded flyer beside it. She didn't touch it, but her shoulders stiffened. He waited. After a long moment, she lifted the mirror and looked into it. Her face didn't change, but her fingers curled white around the handle. The night she burned the flyer in the stove. Didn't ask, didn't need permission. She watched it curl and blacken and turn to smoke-shy Isaiah. Watch her. And for the first time, he thought, she might fight and she might win. The man who had broken Eleanor rode into the valley 3 days later. Isaiah knew at the moment the crows rose behind the ridge. He saw them spiraling high over Hemlock Trail, not in panic, not in confusion, but in a long, slow turn, like they were watching something crawl its way toward them. He didn't wake Elena. She was asleep in the cot by the fire, one hand still loosely curled around the knife under her blanket. Instead, Isaiah stepped onto the porch, shouldered his rifle, and stared down the path that would bring hell back into her life. He saw the first rider just past noon. Young, nervous, looking everywhere except where it mattered. Not from around here. The second rider came an hour later, clean-shaven, saddled, polished, eyes to flat. The third wasn't a rider. He walked. Boots made no sound on the dirt, hands clasped behind his back, black coat brushing the tops of his boots like a curtain drawn before a show begins. He walked like the devil had told him he owned the land, and maybe, in his mind, he did. Elena didn't need to see him to know. When Isaiah came in that night, she was already sitting up, her knife drawn, her eyes dark. They're here, she whispered. He didn't ask how she'd found her voice. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded once. Malric, she asked. Isaiah poured a cup of tea. 3 men, 1 walking. Guessing that's him. She didn't move, didn't cry, didn't break. Just said, he'll try to bring me back. Isaiah looked up. No, he said, he'll fail. That night, she told him what had been done. She didn't tell it like a confession. She told it like a fact, like reciting a ledger. She had been 13 when they took her. The cult called themselves the Sanctified Remnant. They lived in camps up in the Salt Range. Called themselves God's Chosen. Malric was their preacher, but also their judge and their executioner. He said I had a loud soul, Elena whispered, staring into the fire. Said it made men stray. So he fixed it. How? He made the other girls stop talking to me. Then he stopped feeding me. Then she touched the brand under her collarbone. Said silence would come when hunger taught me who I was. Isaiah said nothing. She turned to him. They buried a girl alive once, she sang while they did it. Malric said her mouth was the devil's gate, said death was the cure. Isaiah's hand curled around the mug so tight his knuckles went white. Elena didn't flinch. I didn't cry, she said softly. Not once. He hated that. Isaiah met her eyes. He's not taking you back. She held his gaze. Then what are we doing? Planning. By morning, the riders were closer. Isaiah saw their tracks at the edge of the stream. Boot prints. Hooves. A scattering of feathers where someone had shot a hawk for fun. He counted 5 now. And he knew men like Malric didn't come for peace. That evening, Elena brought him the axe. I can't shoot, she said. But I can swing. He didn't argue. He just handed her the sharpening stone. She sat on the porch, running the blade along and in slow, even strokes. The sound sang like warning. Night fell early. In the dark. They built a line of bells from tin cups and fishing wire. Hung them in the trees. Just beyond the tree line, every sound would sing. Isaiah cleaned the rifle. Elena crushed salt and charcoal in a bowl with a pestle, spreading the black powder across the doorway and the base of the windows. It wasn't magic, but it felt like it, like she was unwriting what had been written on her. Sometime after midnight, they came, not all at once, but in pieces. First, the jingle of a bridle, then the snap of a branch, then the high, clear ring of one of the tin-cup bells. Elena rose silently and stepped to the corner, axe in hand. Isaiah crouched by the window. 5 men in the clearing. Malric at the center, dressed in black, hands behind his back like he was there to negotiate the purchase of something he already owned. He didn't knock, didn't shout. Just said, quietly, child, come out. The hunger ends when you return to the fold. Inside, Elena said nothing. Malric took a step forward. You were made to be empty, he called. But I can fill you. I forgive you. She stepped into the firelight beside Isaiah. Didn't open. The door. Just stared through the window. And whispered, I forgive you. Then lifted the latch. Isaiah moved fast. The door opened and the first man raised his weapon, but Elena was already swinging. The axe hit the post beside him, splintering wood. He stumbled back. Isaiah fired once, shattering the lantern in the second man's hand. Darkness swallowed the clearing. The fight was fast. Messy. Elena didn't aim for the head or chest. She aimed for hands, for knees, for voices. She'd learned how to silence without sound. Isaiah fought like a man whose life had already been taken once and come back meaner. And Malric, he didn't lift a hand, didn't run, didn't speak. He just watched, smiling. It was Elena who faced him last. Face to face, close now. The night bleeding quiet again around them. She raised the axe. Malric spread his arms. You won't, he whispered. You're still mine. She didn't swing. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the wooden spoon she'd carved. Held it up between them. He looked at it, confused. Then she dropped it at his feet and turned her back, walked. Inside, Isaiah shut the door, locked it, and Malric, for all his words, for all his poison, didn't follow, didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared down at that spoon like it was a weapon that had already cut him open. Then he left. Alone. The forest held its breath after Malric left. No wind, no bird song. No sound except the soft ticking of embers in the hearth, like the cabin itself was counting its own heartbeats. Isaiah sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes never leaving the trail. But the preacher didn't return. Not that night. Not ever. The next morning, the clearing was still. Not safe, never that. But still, Elena woke with ash in her hair and splinters in her palm. The axe lay by the door. The spoon was gone. She didn't ask where Malric had gone. Didn't need to. She just stood, walked outside, and stared at the place where the cult symbol had been nailed weeks ago. Then, without a word, she sat in the dirt and started to dig. Isaiah watched her for a long time before asking, "What are you doing?" She didn't look up. Planting. They never found the other men's bodies. Not all of them. The forest took them, as it takes most things not meant to be here. The only thing left behind was Malric's coat. Isaiah burned it in the fire pit. Didn't speak while it turned to smoke. Didn't look away. Elena didn't either. She began to speak more after the not often, but when she did, her voice was clear, measured, as if every word cost something and she was only willing to spend on what mattered. Isaiah didn't ask her to talk. He listened when she did, and sometimes, when she sat on the porch and hummed under her breath. He stayed quiet just to hear the music of her existing. Spring turned to summer. The frost gave way to sun-thick mornings and wildflowers growing in the fields. Where Malric's men had once stood, Elena planted squash, tomatoes, and rows of something she called holy dirt flowers, wild lavender, mostly. She said they kept the bad spirits from clinging to the soles of your boots. Isaiah asked if that was something the cult taught her. She smiled. Actually smiled. Dan said, "No, that part was just me. She built her own shed beside the cabin, didn't ask. Just started collecting wood. At first, Isaiah thought it was for firewood. Then one day he came home to find for walls going up. She was sawing her own beams, using the same axe that had split the night open. I'll sleep there," she said. For a while, he didn't argue, didn't help either. She didn't want help, but he left extra nails on the table and sharpened the saw blades every Sunday without a word. One night, months after the last bell had rung, Elena sat by the fire and said, "I never wanted revenge." Isaiah looked up. She was staring into the flame, fingers wrapped around a mug of broth. "I just wanted to be heard, without speaking, without begging." He nodded once. "You were," he said. She looked at him. "I know." A year passed. She taught herself to carve properly. Not just spoons, though she made dozens, but bowls, handles, even charms, the good kind. She wore a string of them around her neck. Wood, not bone. Soft, not sharp. People in town began to ask about her wares. Isaiah went in once a month, brought back orders. They didn't ask who made them. They knew. The final scar she bore was on her throat, not a mark you could see, not one anyone had given her. It was the absence, the ache, the missing sound of years where her voice was not allowed to matter. But sometimes, at night, she would hum. Not for Isaiah. Not for the world. Just for herself. And he would sit nearby, mending rope or polishing his boots, and let the quiet music fill the room. Not loud. Not grand. But real. Alive. One evening, a letter came, addressed only to the girl in the mountains. The handwriting was careful, familiar. Inside was a single scrap of paper. "I was wrong. They let me go after I said you ran. I hope you find peace." Elena read it, folded it, tossed it into the fire, then turned to Isaiah and said, "Let's make stew." She never called herself a survivor, never said she was healed. Never said she was whole. But she woke up each morning and built something, planted something, wrote something, and Isaiah, quiet as ever, sat beside her with his tools and his silence and his deep, steady presence that said, "I hear you, even when you don't speak." She'd been starved into silence, but he'd heard every word she never said. And in that little cabin, where bells no longer rang and preachers no longer came, she made herself full. Again. Slowly. Fiercely. And on her own terms.